Like I said, hopefully you all are doing okay. Let me share the screen here, and that way we can look at we can take a look at our chapter 5 here. Okay. Yes, Jesse, go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry, I got distracted because I had to sign for a certified mail that came.
No worries.
Um, I was just going to ask, are both chapter 4 and 5 due Wednesday?
No. Chapter 5 is going to be due. Well, chapter 4 is due this Wednesday since we finished it last week, and then chapter
Okay.
5 will be due the Wednesday when we come back from spring break. So
Okay.
not next week, but the Wednesday after.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, I had to sign for a certified mail and got distracted from everything you were saying. I apologize.
No worries, it's fine. No, I was just saying that we're gonna have to try to finish up a little bit quicker. That's all I was saying. But no, don't worry, these things happen. I get you've seen it too. Like they'll leave packages. I know it's a little bit different, but they when you're working from home, you deal with those distractions. So I understand. It's totally fine. But anyway, so let's go ahead and start with chapter 5, which deals with civil rights here. Now, let me ask you all this question really quickly. What do y'all when y'all think of the term civil rights, like what kind of comes to y'all's mind with the idea of civil rights, the concept of civil rights? What do you all think that means to you all? What kind of jumps to your mind when you all think of civil rights? I'm sure you all have heard this term before, right? Like in your history classes, I'm sure, in the news. What comes to y'all's mind? Excuse me. Let me see. Okay, let's check. In the chat, religious freedom. Okay, yeah, that's yeah, we talked about that before, right? We talked about that in the previous chapter, right? That obviously, freedom of religion. Um, that of course is an example of civil liberties, protections against too much government overreach. And right, and so when we look at this concept of civil rights, we're going to look at the way groups throughout American history, and not just within history, but also even today, we see how certain groups are striving for equality, and that's the basis of what civil rights is, right? It's the way that certain groups are treated within society, and how government throughout history has tried to to provide more equality for these groups, right? Obviously, of course, it's taken some time. There's been a lot of incidences that have happened dealing with civil rights, and so we're going to take a look. This chapter is going to be very big on history. Obviously, of course, we're going to take a look at slavery. We're going to take a look at the American Civil Rights Movement in response to the Jim Crow era that happened after the Civil War, after slavery was abolished. Let's take a look at the women's suffrage movement and their push for equality, not just for voting, but also just to be treated equally within society. We're going to look at some other groups as well. Uh, but we're going to focus mostly on those two groups. But there's other groups also that we'll talk about, such as other minority groups such as Hispanics, Asian Americans. We'll also talk about people with disabilities as well. We'll also talk about the LGBTQ community and their movements, to try to gain equality. So we'll talk about marriage equality and things like that. So yeah, so in a nutshell, the first slide that we're going to take a look at gives a comparison of the two, right? So as covered in the previous chapter, civil liberties are phrased as negatives, what governments must not do. Civil liberties protect Americans from various forms of governmental abuse, right? These are the rules, right? That you can't, government can't do this, government can't do that. It's very punitive in nature in terms of holding government at bay, right? Keeping government from being able to intrude upon people's daily lives. And if they are going to intrude upon people's daily lives, they have to have a good and just reason for it. Civil rights, on the other hand, are positives. This is what the government must do to guarantee equal citizenship and protect citizens from discrimination. Because as we mentioned right now, there have been incidences of discrimination, within our history. And so we're not going to shy away from that history. But the good thing, of course, as we'll talk about here, excuse me, is that we have made progress, right? The United States has made a lot of progress when it comes to more of this equal treatment, when it comes to certain marginalized groups and things like that. And so we'll definitely talk about that, right? Civil rights regulate who can participate in the political process and how they can participate. So examples include who can vote, who can hold office, who can serve on juries, and when and how citizens can petition the government to take action. Civil rights also define how people are treated in employment, education, and other aspects of American society. So we'll also take a look at some key pieces of legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll also take a look at Title IX, the Educational Amendments 1972, the Americans with Disabilities Act 1990. We're going to take a look at all these. Now, again, as I mentioned before, this chapter is very lengthy, so we might not be able to hit on all of those as, we might not be able to go in detail as much as I would like, but we'll definitely cover all this, right? So it's important for you all to see what civil rights is and how it impacts us, right? Because, like I said, when people think of civil rights, they usually think of like the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, and rightfully so. They think of leaders like Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and we're going to take a look at those groups as well here. But that's not the only example of civil rights within American society, right? Like I said, we might not think of like people with disabilities as also needing civil rights, but the truth is that they do, right? Because people who are disabled should be able to live their lives, excuse me, with as little restriction as possible. What I mean by this is we shouldn't just, people who had disabilities back, hundreds of years ago, right? They just were lock them up in the insane asylum, right? Because they were so different from people, right? That's not the case anymore. Now these people need to be treated with respect, with dignity, and society needs to do as good of a job as possible to allow for people with disabilities to be able to live their lives and function, and not feel like they have, this handicap, right? Sorry, okay, no worries, that's fine. We're just barely getting started, no worries. But yeah, so obviously, of course, we're going to take a look at, what discrimination is. So unfortunately, the United States has a history of slavery and racial discrimination. It is what it is. The history speaks for itself in terms of these things that have happened, right? So obviously, of course, discrimination, the use of any unreasonable and unjust criterion for exclusion, right? Because when we look at the concept of discrimination, and of course, as we look at the history, we're going to see how there have been, changes and movements that have addressed these discriminatory issues, and we have made progress. There's still progress that still needs to be made in terms of some of these areas, like we'll talk about here within this chapter. But that's not to say that there hasn't been progress, so to speak, throughout our, we're trying to form that more perfect union, right? We're not there yet, but we're trying to form that more perfect union, as was mentioned by, the founders of our Constitution. So the concept of discrimination, right? The use of any unreasonable and unjust criteria, right? Because when we think of discrimination, usually the first example we think of is like racism, right? And we think of like people being discriminated against because of their color of their skin. And when we think about that, that's very sad to see, right? Because someone's skin color should not be a determining factor in terms of how people get treated within society, because those are things that we can't control. Like, I can't control my race, ethnicity, background. I can't control that. I can't choose which family I was born into, right? So those are things that are beyond my control, and so it's not fair for for us to be discriminated against simply because of our background, what family we were born into, and the things that make us us, right? The uniqueness, right, in terms of our race and things like that, right? So that's why when discriminatory laws are inconsistent with the traditional liberty, that's what it's talking about, right? That if we are living in the land of the free and the home of the brave, of course we need to be able to see everyone for who they are, try to treat everyone with respect, try to treat everyone with equality, right? Because again, those differences that we have are beyond our control, and we're all still part of the human race, right? So again, and I've never understood the whole concept of discrimination. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand why someone would like have hate for someone just because they look different. I mean, that's beyond my comprehension and understanding. But unfortunately, there's still something that still goes on today. And we'll talk about some of that as well. So under the 14th Amendment, civil rights became part of the U.S. Constitution. We will talk about the 14th Amendment a little bit later on here as part of the post-Civil War amendments. But the 14th Amendment is regarded as one of the most important, if not the most important, um, constitutional amendments in our Constitution, because it creates the idea of this concept of equal protection, right? So civil rights refers to the obligation imposed on government to take positive action to protect citizens from any illegal action of government agencies and of other private citizens, right? So this idea of civil rights is meant as a way to ensure that people are going to be protected against government overreach that's looked at as unfair, right? Again, as long as if it falls under these protected classes, such as race, gender, age, ethnicity, all those are considered protected classes. So if you get discriminated against based on those, which again, these are things beyond your control, then that is definitely legal, right? And we'll talk about some of those examples here in terms of discrimination, not just more outright discrimination like we saw during the Civil War and then afterwards during, the Jim Crow era, but even more so today, right? When it comes to like employment practices and things like that. So we'll talk about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as well, that came about from the American Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Act, where now employers can't decide not to hire someone just because of their protected statuses. But the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment guarantees citizens the equal protection of the laws and serves as a basis for the civil rights of African Americans, women, and other groups. So I believe we mentioned this before, but let's talk about it a little bit more in detail. So the 14th Amendment is really important because it talks about the equal protection. And what equal protection means is that everyone is supposed to be equal in the eyes of the law. So it doesn't matter what your race, gender, ethnicity, age, none of that's supposed to matter. That the law is supposed to be applied equally to everyone. Socioeconomic status isn't supposed to matter. That the law is the law, and if you violate it, then you need to be held accountable. That's what the Equal Protection Clause is all about. And so the Equal Protection Clause has been used as a way to advance, equality for groups that have been marginalized before. This was the basis for, the civil rights movement within the 1950s. We'll talk about Brown versus Board of Education and how the Equal Protection Clause was cited as a means to ban discrimination in the schools, and then ultimately other cases would build upon this idea of discrimination to culminate in the Civil Rights Act, to where now people cannot be discriminated in public accommodations or even private establishments here. And yes, and of course the other thing about the Equal Protection Clause is that it's also used for other. So even though it was written with the African Americans in mind, because the whole concept of the Equal Protection Clause was now that the slaves were now free, and they were, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment was to incorporate them within American society by providing them citizenship status and also providing them equality. So even though the 14th Amendment was designed with the African Americans in mind, it's been used in other cases, like the Obergefell v. Hodges marriage equality case also cites the 14th Amendment as a means to say that, that same-sex couples should be entitled to the same, equal protection of the law as heterosexual couples, right? So even though the 14th Amendment was not designed with the LGBTQ community in mind, the LGBTQ community is now a new group that is advocating for equality, and so the 14th Amendment can also be used for that group as well here. But anyway, so let's so for the first couple of parts of this chapter, we're going to focus on the women's suffrage movement, as well as right. So we're going to take a look at the women. Let me just check the time. We're going to take a look at the women's suffrage movement, as well as the African American civil rights movement here. So, and like I said, everyone, I'm sorry that you can tell I'm really not myself today. Like I'm really sick. So, but we'll try my best. We'll try to see if we have to leave early. Just please, just keep that in mind. But we'll see. So the United States also excluded women from politics and voting for many years. Women were not granted voting rights nationwide until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. But even before 1920, women were already active in the public activities. We'll talk about the Seneca Falls Convention. And women were important in the moral realm of social reform. So they played leading roles in the abolitionist movement, and they also were very active in the temperance movement too. So I know this is kind of getting into U.S. history part one. But the women's suffrage movement was, came out of this obviously, of course, that was the ultimate goal for women, was to be able to gain the right to vote nationally. Um, but even beforehand, women were also advocating for, excuse me, for like equality in other areas, right? You know, the concept of trying to move past antiquated social norms, right? And I'm sure you all are familiar with these social norms, right? That originally back, several hundred years ago, the idea was that, women were supposed to stay at home, they were supposed to raise the family, they were supposed to cook and provide, for the family while the husbands went and worked, right? Uh, so women were starting to make the argument that, hey, like, we should be able to work as well, right? We should be able to, uh, be on equal footing to men, right? And so this of course was the social norms were starting to change here, due to women and the advocacy that they were engaging in, such as we'll talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, some of these these leading figures within not just women's suffrage movement, but just in general, for women equality and all that stuff. So, but yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about them later on here. So okay, so let's move back to slavery, right? So no issue in U.S. history has been more divisive than slavery. I mean, uh, there was a civil war that was fought over this, right? So that should tell you just how divisive slavery is. And when we talk about slavery, and I know this is more so like when I teach history, I also teach U.S. history. What I like to tell my students is that, especially the history students, what I like to tell them is that, when people think of slavery, they usually tend to think of the Civil War, but slavery was going on long before the Civil War. The Civil War was just the culmination point, it was the breaking point. But as you can see here, look, the first slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, year before the Plymouth colony was established in Massachusetts. So going back to over 200, pretty much 250 years, right? Slavery had been around in the United States for 250 years before, before the American Civil War, right? Now, of course, it took that all that time for it to get to the point where the nation was just completely divided on this. So obviously, of course, and also do remember that it wasn't just the American South that had slaves. Slavery was also in the North as well. It wasn't as pronounced as in the American South for economic reasons, as we're going to see here, right? White Southerners built their agricultural economy, especially cotton production, on a large slave labor force. Slavery became such a vital part of the South's economy that any efforts to restrict or abolish it was met with fierce resistance from Southern states. Slaves periodically revolted against their inhumane treatment. Such revolts, however, were always brutally suppressed by state militia and local law enforcement. Right. So the reason why this is important to know, everyone, is we have to understand the reason for why slavery was still operating in the American South, and why the South was so bent on keeping the institution that they decided to leave the Union. Because you have to understand that again, to try to explain what was going on within the region, right? That you had all of this slave labor that was being imported from Africa. Originally, a lot of the slaves were going to the West Indies, right? They were going to, some of the Caribbean islands first, right? With to man the sugar, the sugar plantation. But then some of them started to move up north into Virginia and the Carolinas, Georgia as well. In Virginia, tobacco was the main cash crop there. Rice and indigo was in the Carolinas as well as in Georgia. And so what was happening is that you needed this was when the indentured servitude system was ending and was being replaced by slaves. Originally, a lot of them tried to enslave the Native Americans, but because they knew the area, they could escape. So the idea was to import slaves from Africa, bring them to a foreign land, across across the ocean. And so that was the whole decision there, because the industries that the South was engaging in needed a lot of manpower. So they looked at slaves as no different than like an investment, right? They treat no different than the than like cattle and things like that, unfortunately, right? So they treated human beings like a commodity and things like that, right? So, and of course there were revolts, such as there was Nat Turner's rebellion. We also had the Stoner rebellion as well. So there had been some revolts. There was also John Brown, the abolitionist, who tried to uh, start a revolt as well here. So there were several of these these attempted revolutions here to try to to try to leave their servitude and revolt from their masters and things like that. So opponents of slavery organized the abolitionist movement, a movement to abolish slavery spread among Northerners in the 1830s. Anti-slavery political parties emerged, as well with the creation of the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party. The Liberty Party was staunchly anti-slavery, while the moderate Free Soil Party aimed to restrict slavery from spreading into new Western territories. Now, this, of course, is important to remember, right? That the Northerners that were against slavery were a little bit divided on this issue, right? Uh, some of them took the more moderate viewpoint where that's fine, we'll keep slavery in the South, but we don't want it to spread anywhere further than the South. Whereas the Liberty Party, was going, straight abolition, right? So there were different levels to how people that were against slavery viewed this issue. And of course, you also have to remember, everyone, again, this is more like on history, but that one of the main catalysts for what kicked off the Civil War in terms of why it happened when it happened was because the United States had just gained a lot of Western territory. I mean, they had had the Louisiana Purchase, and that those territories, excuse me, were finally starting to be settled. Oregon had just become admitted into a state, so was Texas, as well as the American Southwest that had been gained in the war with Mexico, in the 1840s. So there was a lot of new territory that people were not sure in terms of what the status of that territory would be. Would the territory be a slave territory where people could take slaves, or would it be a free territory where slavery was outlawed? And of course, we also have to talk a little bit about, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was introduced the idea of popular sovereignty by, by Douglas, the senator from Illinois. So he, of course, was advocating that the people in the territory should decide for themselves whether they should be free or slave, right? But again, and of course, that became a big mess because then you had people from other states moving there, and it was just this big. It was like a precursor. They call it Bleeding Kansas. It was a precursor to the Civil War. So some opponents of slavery took matters into their own hands, aiding in the escape of runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad. So of course, this is Harriet Tubman and her efforts to secretly move slaves that were wanting to leave the South and take them over to Canada, right, so that they could leave the United States and gain their freedom up there. Now let's talk about the Dred Scott v. Sanford case a little bit. Now this was also a major precursor to the American Civil War. Let me just check the time here. Now, have any of y'all heard of this case before? This is one of the more infamous cases that the Supreme Court has levied. Is anyone familiar with the Dred Scott v. Sanford case? Do y'all remember this from history class, or not really? Does anybody kind of remember, or nobody really remembers Dred Scott v. Sanford?
Is this before the Mom Betts case or after?
Which case again?
Mom Betts? I think that's what her name was, no? She went on to become renamed Freedman.
Right. I'm not sure if it's before or after. I believe it's around the same time though. So it could be within that same time period. Although I want to say it's before, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, of course, I could look that up and get back to you, but this case happened right before the Civil War occurred, and this case was really important because this basically, it's not a surprise that just a few short years later the Civil War would happen, right? Because this was the situation involving Dred Scott, who, as it says here, right, was taken by his owner to the free state of Illinois and to the free territory of Wisconsin, whereupon Scott sued for his freedom, right? Because the idea was that the background of this case was that Dred Scott was owned by a gentleman by the name of John Emerson, who was he was a Union physician. So he was out on the western frontier because Illinois and Wisconsin, modern day Minnesota, those were considered the western frontier at the time, right? So the idea was that as soon as John Emerson moved, because originally he was in Missouri, but then he moved to Illinois. As soon as he moved to Illinois, the idea was that Dred Scott would be considered free, right? Because he was now in a free state, in a free territory. Now, ultimately, what happened was that Emerson passed away. His sister, his Emerson's sister and her husband, Sanford, what they did was they decided to, claim Dred Scott as their slave, right, as their property. But then Dred Scott sued, and then it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen and it was declared to be the property of his master. So the court went further, ruling that all blacks were not U.S. citizens, and the decision split the country deeply and helped precipitate the Civil War. So the idea was that the Supreme Court saw that Dred Scott, at least they ruled, that Dred Scott did not have the right to bring this case up to begin with in the first place because he's not a citizen, so he doesn't have any legal right to a trial, to legal, to legal proceedings. So then the idea was that, okay, so if Dred Scott does not have standing, if he does not have the ability to file a lawsuit in the first place, then the case shouldn't have come at all, right? The court should have been like, okay, we shouldn't have heard this case to begin with, so that's it, we're done here. But the court did not do that. Instead, the court decided to rule that the Missouri Compromise was not constitutional. The Missouri Compromise had been a previous law that had been passed in 1820 that set forth geographic boundaries for slave states and free states. Basically, what I mean by this is that any state that was south of Missouri could be admitted as slave. Any state north of Missouri could not. They'd only could be admitted as free states. But what the Supreme Court ruled was that law was invalid, that it was unconstitutional, because the Supreme Court was making the argument that violates your right to property, that slavery is a fundamental right, for people to have slaves because they are considered property, at least in terms of the way the court saw it. So at the time. So ultimately, to make a long story short, what this did was that this eliminated that geographic requirement. And so now you had a situation where slavery could have gone anywhere. Slavery could have gone all across the country, right? So it could have gone to Boston, Massachusetts, Oregon as well, right? There was no geographic boundary. So it's not surprising that just a few short years later, you would have, the Civil War, which of course was the 1860 election had a big part in that as well, right? Where Lincoln won the election but did not get a single vote in the American South because he wasn't on the ballot, right? So a lot of the Southerners felt that they were not going to support Lincoln because none of the South voted for him, right? So Lincoln won because he won the state of New York, which was by far the largest populated state. So in the Electoral College, he was able to win. He was able to win, even though there was a four-way race, right? And things like that. So with that being said, so obviously, of course, we have, so then of course the Civil War happens. Let's shift gears a little bit here back to the women's suffrage movement, or the women's rights movement. Sorry. So Seneca Falls, New York, is where the modern women's movement began. A convention was held in 1848 in upstate New York to advance the social rights of women. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. So the Seneca Falls Convention is really important, right? Because this is where we start to see women start to, take a role within advocating for themselves, right? To want to strive for this idea of equality, right? So the convention drafted what was called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So just like the Declaration of Independence, you all know the famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," right? So they added, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," right? So they added the women part in there, to advocate that women should also be considered equal, right? So it made the then radical demand to give women the right to vote, and the convention and its participants were subjected to widespread ridicule, but successfully pressured New York to pass the Married Women's Property Act, which affirmed the right of married women to own property. Now, interestingly enough, when New York was part of, when it was part of the New Netherlands, right? It was a Dutch colony. Women had more rights in New Netherland, than opposed to some of the neighboring British colonies, right? Because the Dutch were a little bit more progressive when it came to women's rights and things like that. So originally they had some rights, but then they lost them when New Netherland became New York. But then the women were able to get those rights back, for the right of married women to own property, especially in the case of like if their husband passes away, right? That women can still retain that right to property, being that they were they're the widows, right? So the Declaration of Sentiments is really important, right? Because it puts pen to paper the it puts pen to paper the women's rights movement, what the women's rights movement is about, what they're advocating for. And as I mentioned before, right, it's this idea that women are wanting, the sense of equality, right, to be able to not just be stuck at home and just be subservient to their husbands, right, to be able to go to work, also to be able to go to school, right, to be able to pursue careers, to be able to make lives for themselves. Because, again, the idea is just because they're women doesn't mean that they're also not entitled to be able to, uh, to be able to engage in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So, they should also have that rights just as much as men do. So this is, the beginnings of the women's rights movement. And, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were very instrumental in this, right? Because um, they, of course, saw the hypocrisy of a lot of these male abolitionists, because there's an interesting story where they attended an anti-slavery rally in London, where they were trying to attend it, but they were not allowed in because they were women. So the hypocrisy was, oh, these virtue signaling men over here, they're all against slavery, but they don't like discrimination against what's going on with the slaves, but they'll discriminate against women, right? So that definitely stuck with them, and so they decided to advocate amongst themselves. And what's also interesting is that Frederick Douglass, the slave, he attended the Seneca Falls Convention because he saw solidarity between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. Okay, anyway, so as we mentioned, of course, after the Civil War ended, let me just check the time here really quickly. Okay, so after, of course, the Civil War ended, the Civil Rights Amendments were added, right? So do keep these in mind, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law, as we mentioned earlier. And the 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights for African American men. So there is a reason order, right? Because you have to. So first, of course, you have to address the major issue that caused the Civil War in the first place, right? The question of slavery. So first you have to abolish it, right? Then you have to provide citizenship rights for the newly freed African American slaves, as well as providing rights for them, right? So the next two amendments provide rights for them to now be able to participate in the political process here, and actually be citizens, right? Now, the book doesn't really go too much in detail on this. The Texas government does more of this. Juneteenth is also important, right? So I'm sure you all are familiar with the Juneteenth holiday. It just became a federal holiday a couple of years ago. It used to be a state holiday, but now a couple of years ago it became a national holiday. Let me check the chat here really quickly. So June 19th, yes, yes. Do you recall what the significance of June 19th, 1865 was? Do you recall what it was? Why it's important? Why is Juneteenth important? That's when the news that slavery had been abolished reached Galveston. Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. Because obviously, of course, in 1863 we had the Emancipation Proclamation, that where Lincoln had declared the slaves, that in the rebelling states to be free, right? But that didn't mean that the slaves were automatically free, right? Because it's not like the Southerners were going to be like, okay, sure, Lincoln, yes, take our slaves, yes, so Lincoln said that you're free, okay, you're free to go, right? So obviously, of course, they had to win the war in order to enforce it, right? And so, right, and that's when the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation reaches Galveston after the Civil War is ended, and yes, and so and of course, Juneteenth is celebrated in Texas, but it's also, and this is something I didn't know until recently, that Juneteenth is also celebrated in other parts of the country. and so much so now that we have a national holiday for it, right? So that's why thankfully we get another day off in summer, like in summer one, like it's on a Monday, I believe, so we get a day off from work because of Juneteenth. And for good reason, right? New military reached the Galveston Post and thus, yes, exactly, right. So it was being enforced now, because now they could, right? Because now that they had won the war, exactly. So yes, exactly. So just wanted to mention that really quickly. Very important holiday. Which I'm glad, that people are getting more, people are learning more about it. Okay, so let's talk about Reconstruction here really quickly, and then of course we'll get into the Jim Crow era here. Okay, so the start of Reconstruction. So in the immediate years after the Civil War, federal troops entered the South to protect the rights of African Americans. So like we just talked about here, the start of that in Galveston, and then moving throughout the rest of the former Confederacy. So Reconstruction is an interesting time in American history because Reconstruction is not just reconstruction of the infrastructure. If you remember from your U.S. History Part 1 class, you're probably familiar that the South was absolutely totally devastated, demolished, whatever word you want to use. Uh, they have like early pictures of like Atlanta, Georgia, and how it's just piles of rubble everywhere. The entire city is just decimated. Richmond, Virginia is decimated. Now, thankfully, Texas avoided a lot of that because there wasn't too much fighting going on in Texas during the Civil War. A lot of it was going off, east of the Mississippi River for the most part. So Texas escaped a lot of that destruction. But regardless of that, Reconstruction was not just to rebuild the infrastructure, but also to rebuild society. Right now that the African Americans are now, the former slaves have now been freed and have been given citizenship status. Now the U.S. government had to integrate them within society, right? So that's what the federal troops were doing. The federal troops were uh, the southern states were being basically administered under military rule for the most part, as they were transitioning the American South to be able to be reintegrated back into American society fully. So from 1869 to 1877, blacks were elected to many political offices. This is where the first African American members of Congress were coming from, right? Two black senators were elected from Mississippi, and a total of 14 African Americans were elected to the House of Representatives. And a lot of this was happening was because a lot of the former Confederates and former Confederate sympathizers were banned from voting at the time, right? So you only had a select few of people that were eligible to vote, and so they were, of course, voting for, and these were just the Unionists and the Republicans, right? So the African Americans, of course, obviously aligned with the Republican Party because at the time, the Republican Party was, it's not the same Republican Party that we have today, right? The Republican Party back then was the party of Lincoln, the party of progressives, right? Because the idea to abolish slavery and to end it is a pretty progressive idea, right? It's not keeping with the status quo, right? It's very progressive. So the Republicans at the time, they were the progressives, and the Democrats were the conservatives. So the Republicans, being the progressives, being the party that had freed the slaves, obviously, of course, the African Americans were going to align themselves with the Republican Party. So this is where you started to see the Republican Party start to win a lot of these seats here within the American South. However, Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877. There was some scandal with the presidential election the previous year. So Southern delegates allowed Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. In exchange, federal troops left the South, and so the South then adopted what was called the Jim Crow laws, which discriminated against African Americans. Now, I'm sure you all are familiar with the Jim Crow laws, right? Have you all remember this from history class? Does this kind of sound familiar to you all? When I think there's a picture over here, right? This is a very telling picture, right? Because when we look at the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal doctrine, this is what it's talking about, right? The clear separation and the segregation of whites and the minority groups, especially within the American South, right? Where everything was being segregated, where you had the schools being segregated, you had the restaurants, the movie theaters, everything was being segregated to where minority students could not go to the white high schools, right? Where all the races were clearly separated. We'll talk about Rosa Parks a little bit later, right? How that on the buses, right, that the minority groups had to sit in the back, and if if the bus got too full, then they had to give up their seat, right? So we're going to talk about how that Congress, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court, when they look at the Jim Crow law, the Plessy versus Ferguson case is what really put this forward here. But we'll talk about that here in a minute. Let's talk about the women's suffrage movement again real quickly. So even after formerly enslaved men won the right to vote, most politicians in both parties still rejected appeals for women's suffrage. At the state level, a referendum in 1867 to give women the vote in Kansas failed, and in 1872, Susan B. Anthony and several other women were arrested in Rochester, New York, for illegally registering and voting in that year's election. Judge Ward Hunt assessed Anthony a fine of $100, but did not sentence her to jail, and Anthony refused to pay the fine. So what this is talking about here is that the women's suffrage movement starts to gain steam after the Civil War because they see that, if the United States government is, provided civil rights for, for the African Americans, particularly African American male men, this could be the time for the women's, suffrage movement to really pick up steam, to gain momentum, right? Because now we've seen evidence of the government providing civil rights for certain groups, so why not women as well, right? And the book talks about how, and I guess this is a little bit more on the history side, that within the women's suffrage movement there were different viewpoints, right? So some in the women's suffrage movement felt that, and this is how it started off, right? They felt that they needed to go to the states first to get referendums to allow women to vote at the state level, right? So it wouldn't be until a little bit later where they would eventually uh, coalesce into trying to get a constitutional amendment to provide women the right to vote nationally. So the idea was to go at the states first, and in some cases, and they were successful in some of these other states, right? Like Wyoming was the first state to allow women the right to vote, as well as some of these other Western states. There's some theories about that. As to why the Western states allowed women the right to vote before the Eastern states did. And one of the theories is that because out in the West, life was still very dangerous, and everyone had to pull together. So men and women were equal in terms of trying to survive, right? That there wasn't time to have, to discriminate against women because people were just concerned if they were going to survive the cold winter, right? So women were able to gain more respect out in the West because they were all in it together, right? There was a greater sense of community, as opposed to like out, back east where it was all just a bunch of cities and people just kind of minded their own business, so to speak, right? They weren't. It wasn't really a life or death situation out in New York. I mean, not to say that it wasn't dangerous, but it was more pressing in some of these Western states where they didn't have the support, the infrastructure like we have in the Eastern states. So that's a popular theory that's been floated around about why the Western states, why men were more accommodating of women and seeing them more as equals out west as opposed to in the East here. But again, we'll get back to the women's suffrage movement here in a bit. Let's talk a little bit more about separate but equal here, and the Jim Crow era here. Let's see how much time we have. Okay, we got a little bit more time. Okay, so Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It was intended to protect blacks from discrimination and public accommodation. So yes, after Reconstruction, ended, it wasn't a surprise what was going on, where the discrimination was going to occur now that the federal government was no longer involved in the American South. But the Supreme Court declared, excuse me, that the Supreme Court declared that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. Now, you also have to remember that at this time, the Supreme Court is very conservative. It's a conservative court, not just when it came to civil rights, but also for a lot of labor issues, right? This is the time where we start to see, this is during the Gilded Age time, where the Gilded Age, this is where we start to see the Gilded Age time, where during the Gilded Age, we see that a lot of, corporations start to get more involved in government. They start to become a lot larger, and they start to have more of an influence on, government decisions and government actions, right? So this is the rise of, some of these, wealthy, millionaires, such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and how a lot of these tycoons, they're able to build up these large companies, but unfortunately, the workers that work for these companies aren't allowed to form unions and things like that, right? They're not allowed to advocate for better working conditions, right? So of course, we'll see this change during the New Deal. Well, I guess that's more so for history, but the point is that at this time the Supreme Court is more in favor of like business, business and not too much regulation by the federal government. So it's not surprising that the Supreme Court struck this one down because that was the nature of the court at the time. And then another case, of course, that came out a little bit later was the Plessy v. Ferguson case. This is the separate but equal doctrine. Now, this again, just like Dred Scott v. Sanford, this is another one of the more infamous cases in the Supreme Court's history, because it established the doctrine that public accommodations could be segregated by race as long as the facilities were separate but equal. So the idea was that it's not unconstitutional to separate everyone as long as everyone has equality within their separation. Now, as we mentioned before, you can easily see that this was just a facade, because if you look at what was going on in the buses, that already is a problem, because why do the minorities have to sit in the back, and why do they have to give up their seats? Why can't they sit in the front and, other groups give up their seats, right? So I'm just giving you a quick example of how it was clearly a facade just to create a second-class citizenship for minorities. Now, the story behind what happened with Mr. Homer Plessy was that he was on a train in Louisiana. The Louisiana legislature had passed a law saying, regulating the railroads, saying that the railroads had to create separate box cars, for the minorities. And so Mr. Plessy basically, predated Rosa Parks by, by about, half a century. He basically said, he was going to sit in the one that he wanted, right? So so they arrested him. He filed suit, and then he claimed that the 14th Amendment allowed for him to do that. So he was right, in terms of the way we see, the Constitution today, right? Him applying the 14th Amendment by saying that he should be, why is he being treated differently just because of the color of his skin, turned out to be correct, but the Supreme Court did not see it that way at that time. So again, another one of the more infamous cases, right? And so, like we said, this gave rise to the rise of the segregations of all these different venues and accommodations, as well as in public education and the buses. So okay, so let me see how much more time we have. So okay, we've got a little bit more time. Okay, so obviously, of course, in the aftermath of the Plessy decision, and in what was going on with the Jim Crow era, which again we don't really talk too much about it in this chapter. That's more so for Texas government, but of course we also see the rise of the KKK. We see the rise of intimidation by the KKK. We see the rise of lynchings that goes on, mostly in the American South. What I also want to mention to y'all really quickly is that discrimination in the American South was not just, obviously, of course, African Americans got the brunt of it because they were the largest minority group. But in Texas and the Southwest, we also saw discrimination against Hispanics, right? We've also seen lynchings by Hispanics. There's actually, let me mention to y'all really quickly, there's actually a good exhibit at the STC library right now. If any of y'all ever have a chance to go to it, it's on the first floor. It's an exhibit where and I know this because one of the authors that was behind this exhibit, she wrote a book that I read in my Hispanic politics class that I took at UTSA last year, and she documents the lynchings of some Hispanics in South Texas, in the Uvalde area, here in the Valley, and and over in the El Paso area. So they actually have an exhibit. They actually have a pretty good exhibit where they have some of those artifacts from some of those families. So it's at the SCC library. If any of y'all, I can send you all more information on that, but I definitely want y'all to take a look at that if y'all have a chance to. But again, so I just want to mention that some of these other groups, we also talked about the Chinese and the Chinese Exclusion Act out in California. So a lot of these minority groups were being discriminated against. So one of the first groups that formed, that formed to try to reverse this was the NAACP, right? So the Jim Crow system provoked organized groups against it. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today, was established in 1909 and sought to win political rights and relied on political pressure and litigation. So the strategy of the NAACP was to, obviously, of course, to engage in lobbying tactics and grassroots activism and political organization to try to pressure elected officials to do something about the Jim Crow system. But they also engaged in litigation, and this is where the NAACP really gets a lot of attention, is that they were involved in some of these landmark cases like Brown versus Board of Education, which was led by former NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall, who some of y'all that name might sound familiar because he was the first African American Supreme Court justice, which is not surprising, right? If you are the lead attorney for one of the most famous Supreme Court cases of all time, I don't see how I don't see how anyone could top that to where someone else would be more qualified to serve on the Supreme Court, right? I mean that's a no-brainer, right? If you are the lead attorney for that case, then yeah, you pretty much have earned a right to sit on the Supreme Court, right? At least in my opinion, that's kind of like the way I see it. Okay, so let's see. Let's see. I want to see how much more time we have because I want to see if we can get to. Let's see. Okay, yeah. Let's finish off with yeah. Let's finish off with the women's suffrage movement, and then we'll start on the we'll talk about Robert's Board of Education next. Okay, so the women's organization continued to fight for the right of women to vote. Some states granted women the right to vote before the federal government did, like we mentioned. Wyoming was the first state, as well as some of these other Western states like Colorado, Utah, and Idaho as well. The National American Women's Suffrage Association staged meetings, parades, petitions, and protests and helped win passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment. Again, I've got some good videos on this here in Blackboard where it talks about how that the a lot of these women's suffrage groups moving, into the late 1800s towards the beginning of the 20th century started to become a little bit more militant. What I mean by that is they started to be a little bit more assertive and aggressive with their protests. The National Women's Party picketed and got arrested in front of the White House after protesting President Wilson's opposition to a suffrage amendment. So basically, they handcuffed themselves to the tall fence in front of the White House. Alice Paul was, she was there, within that group as well. So what I mean by this is that they were starting to be a little bit more aggressive when it came to some of their protesting tactics, right? To try to gain attention to their struggle and their situation, right? So the women's suffrage movement was definitely organizing at a higher pace. You had higher numbers of women becoming members of these organizations, and they were definitely being a lot more effective to the point where ultimately, the 19th Amendment ultimately was passed, which allowed for women to gain the right to vote nationally, right? So in some of the Western states, they had the right to vote before, but in 1920, which we just had a couple of years ago, we just had the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Women now have the right to vote all across the country. What was also influenced was we also had the first female in Congress also was part of this movement as well here. Can't remember her name, but she was also very instrumental in the. I mean, you can do a quick Google search, you can find it, but yeah, she was also very instrumental in assisting with the women's suffrage movement, ultimately culminating in the for women to gain the right to vote across the country. So okay, that's fine. So we'll go to an end here for today because we're pretty much done here. So okay, everyone. So we're going to. We'll try to cover as much as we can next time. Like I said, I don't know if we'll get to finish everything in this chapter. This chapter is very lengthy, but we have to finish this chapter by this week because we already have to finish this unit by this week. We have to start on public opinion next after spring break, and then we have to do voting. We have to do political parties, elections, and then we also have to move on to the third unit, which talks about Congress, the presidency, and the federal court. So we do have a lot that we have to cover in the next couple of weeks here. So we'll kind of have to go at this a little bit of a faster pace, which that's fine. Like I mentioned earlier, there's more chapters than weeks in the semester, so it happens. That's fine. We'll cover everything that we need to. So, okay, everyone. So, does anyone have any questions before we end for today? Anything else? Hope you all found today's conversation a little bit interesting. I know it was very, very heavy on the history. Jesse, go ahead, sir.
So Wednesday is chapter 4 in the Bill of Rights quiz.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct. Yes. Yeah, finish those by this week. And then chapter 5 stuff that we do after spring break. The draft. Oh, yes. Okay, so we did talk about the signature assignment before. The draft will be due. The draft will be due after spring break. Okay, so not this week. It'll be next week. Okay. And as I mentioned before, just do a quick half page or like a half page double space summary. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I don't have kids, but I'm going to be very busy. I have to finish that UTSA class, or else I'm going to get an F in it because they gave me an incomplete. So I got to finish it already. So I'm gonna use that time to. I have 3 books I have to read, and I have a research paper and a final exam to do. So I'm going to try to get all that done. I mean, I'm going to start on it this week, but oh, I'm so sorry about that, Elder. Yes, that's. Yes, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully. I mean, and again, that's why I try not to assign so much work because I know you all are dealing with a lot of stuff. So I wish my grad school professors would see it that way for me, but it is what it is. So, but yes, everyone, yeah, the just do a half page double space. Thank you so much, Ariana. Yes, just do a half page double space like we talked about before, right? The three things, right? Who you're writing to, what you're writing about, and what's the solution to your issue. And again, and if that changes, that's fine. I just want for you all to give me something so I know that you all are working, right? Because I don't want a situation where like everyone just kind of just waits till the last minute, you know. So that's why I want to have like an early assignment for a due, so that you all can be in the habit of getting it done. So okay, so sounds good. All right, everyone. Okay, so then we'll end for today. You all take care, be safe. Please email me if you have any questions, and we'll see you all on Wednesday, right? We'll finish off the last part of this chapter on Wednesday. We'll talk about Bremer's Board of Education. We'll talk about the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and yes, thank you, Adina. Yes, I think I just need some rest. I was pretty much in bed the whole weekend. I was very like, it's the allergies. The allergies are just really messing with me. But thank you, Ella, thank you so much. So yeah, so we'll finish off chapter 5, what we need to next time. Okay, so the extra going on. Yes, it's yeah, it is what it is. So, but I'll be fine. Thankfully I'm not like it's nothing serious, so I should just be fine. I just need to just rest up a bit. So, okay, everyone, sounds good. You all take care, be safe, and we'll see you all on Wednesday, everyone. Thank you all so much. You all be safe, everyone. All right. Thank you so much, Hazel. You too. You all take care, everyone. Be safe.